In this part of the lecture, we're going to talk about Texas and how it's affected by a larger era in U.S. history known as the Gilded Age, which is really post-Civil War all the way up into the turn of the century, really into the through the early 1900s. But this is a time period that many historians refer to this as the Gilded Age. And it is, and I'll talk about where that gets the name the Gilded Age from in just a moment, but it is a time period of the Second Industrial Revolution. The First Industrial Revolution was on a smaller scale, happened in the early 1800s in the United States, and really was because of the War of 1812 and the fact that America had to start to produce manufacturing on its own, so it really spurs manufacturing. But the Second Industrial Revolution really happens because the Civil War is over. And so we see this is the way it's kind of illustrated. I think this is a good image that really shows all the advances that happen. Now, this is a time period in which laissez-faire politics happens in economics. And what laissez-faire is in French, that means hands off. And essentially that meant that in the United States, the government was very hands off and to businesses. And there were some positive aspects to it, meaning that businesses could, grow and invent unhampered by government regulation. But on the other hand, it meant that the people that were not being protected were the workers and the consumers. And so that's when we start to see the very first monopolies that form, and we'll talk about that as well. But here's another chart. And you can pause this chart if you'd like and just take a look at it. And this is a good visual image of the growth and how it's growing not just in big business and in manufacturing, but also in farming. And this comes from major farming equipment that really transforms farms as well. And of course that affects Texas and specifically West Texas. And let me move myself out of the way a little bit so you can see that completely. And just like I mentioned, one important thing to understand about this time period is that this is the first time that trusts and monopolies form because of this laissez-faire policy that really happens. And so a monopoly is basically when one company, and many of you probably know this because you've played the game of Monopoly before, right? And you think about what's your goal in Monopoly, it's to control the entire board, right? And so that's essentially what a monopoly is. They want to control the entire market. And a lot of times these big businessmen would engage in very ruthless acts, either through, usually through horizontal integration, which is where you buy out all of your competition. But there was also vertical integration in which they'd buy up all the factors of production so nobody could compete with you because the price was so low. But people also tried to avoid the appearance of owning everything. They would create what's known as trusts. And it isn't until Teddy Roosevelt becomes president in 1901 that the trusts are really broken up and people start to challenge the monopolies. And many historians look at this time period as politicians had the least amount of power and the people that had the most were the big businessmen. And the presidents of the late 1800s, why don't we know about them? Because the big businessmen were more important at that time period, almost really, arguably. They had to actually make appointments to meet with these big businessmen. They were so powerful. But we also see a lot of corruption come out of that. And this is where the term the Gilded Age comes from. It was actually, Mark Twain's term, and he wrote a book known as that was called the Gilded Age. And gilded, if you look it up, you can do a quick Google in it. It essentially means that it's kind of a thin layer of gold on the outside. But what happens when you scratch the surface of a very thin layer of gold? You can see the ugliness underneath. And that's essentially what he said. The top 1% controlled half of the United States wealth. They were extremely wealthy. In New York City, for example, there was something known as Millionaires Row, and you'd go 2 miles south and you'd run into the tenements, which were poor areas where poor immigrants were coming in during this time period. In particular, and things that specifically affected Texas, there were new railroad corporations that had huge influence in the state legislatures, specifically in Texas. And we start to see them start to control things, control prices, and all types of things. Lawmakers, very infamously, were in the pockets of a lot of these big businessmen. Either they actually owned stock in these companies themselves, or they were given kickbacks. There were many instances, especially during President Grant's presidency, of corruption within politics during that time period. And here's this percentage that I stated again. The richest 1% received the same income as the bottom half of the population. So that's unbelievable to think that, right? But that's how wealthy they really were. The sheer division of wealth and poverty was extreme in the United States at this time. Because of this big division and the fact that labor really didn't have very much money, we started to see labor unions form and have a little more power in the United States. Now, I want to warn the fact that the labor unions were not favored by the government, were seen as extremists. There were extremists in many of these labor unions. There were people that came from countries. A lot of them were poor immigrants. Came into the country from areas that were in, areas of the world in Southern and Eastern Europe specifically that were in kind of in chaos. And so there were some instances of people that were anarchists that were members of this. It's not that there weren't radicals, but there were people that had honest issues with the payment that they received. And so we started to see these national labor unions form, mainly to talk about pay, but also to talk about working conditions. I mean, it's not like today where there's, OSHA protections and things like that for the workers. If you got your hand cut off when you were in a factory during this time period, you got your hand cut off and you had to live with that. And you would probably lose your livelihood and all kinds of things because of this. One of the first successful labor unions to organize was the Knights of Labor. And this was unique because this was a very inclusive labor union. There were other labor unions that formed, but they only allowed white men. They didn't allow women, and they certainly didn't allow African Americans at that time. But blacks were allowed in the Knights of Labor. Mexican Americans during this time period weren't really parts of unions. There was something known as mutualistas, in which it was kind of labor union-ish, but they were mainly in South Texas during this time period, so they weren't really tied to these activities. In 1886, there was a strike in Texas of rail workers. The governor sends the Texas militia and the Texas Rangers to stop this strike from happening. And this happens all over the United States at a national level and at a state level, in which the federal government steps in to help business out. Part of the reason behind this was the political change that was happening in Texas during this time period. So not just post-Civil War, because we know that there was a large influence of radical Republicans in Texas, much like the rest of the South, with military reconstruction and radical reconstruction that happened. But after Reconstruction ends in 1876, the ex-Confederate politicians come right back into power. The Republican Party fell apart really in the late 1800s. It still has some power nationally. A little bit of power, but they're much more focused on economic and what's happening in the North, supporting big businessmen. They've lost the passion to support African American rights. But blacks during this time period were still members of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party was the one that was Ulysses S. Grant's party that was engaged actually in some of the corruption that occurred. And even though there were no black politicians involved in the corruption, a lot of people said it was because of black rule, which was of course completely false, but that's where they pointed their fingers. The Democrats that take over Texas politics at the time are known as the Redeemers, because they want to redeem Texas back to the old South that it was. And a man named Oren Roberts, who was the person that led the secessionist convention in Texas to lead Texas to secede from the Union, becomes the new governor of of Texas at this time. Now, economically, Oren Roberts does a lot. He reduces the debt. He leaves Texas with a surplus, actually, and balances the budget. But of course, there's a rise in violence against African Americans and mistreatment, and there's an attempt to disenfranchise African Americans, which I'll talk about here in just a minute. But we also see some movement of farmers and some organization of farmers. There are a couple different groups of farmers known as the Greenback Movement and the Grange and the Farmers Alliance Movement. Now, the Greenback Party was a group of farmers that wanted to see paper money, which was utilized in the Civil War, become a thing rather than just rely on the gold standard, which was how money was determined and wealth was determined at this time. And they wanted to see inflation. So you might wonder, why would they want to see inflation happen? And the reason for that is because if there was more money in the system, if more money was produced and they had more money flowing, they would be able to pay back their debts, because a lot of these farmers were in debt. And they were in debt because these railroads could charge whatever they wanted. They have a monopoly on the rail lines. They could charge whatever they wanted on the freight lines. So if they wanted to ship their goods from their farms to markets, they had to pay astronomical rates. And so this rate of the freight rates are going to become a big issue specifically to the farmers. And they're going to try to find ways in order to pay back the crushing debt that they were involved in. There was also a temperance movement happening at this time. So if you don't know what temperance is, it's an anti-alcohol movement. We do know that the 18th Amendment will happen a little later on in 1919 and with the 18th Amendment. But there was a temperance movement happening in the early 1800s. And the difference between temperance and prohibition is temperance is just the active education of what happens with alcohol and trying to reduce alcohol consumption through education and reform. Prohibition is actually making a law to stop alcohol consumption. The group that was really big during this time period that supported this was one that was a national group known as the Women's Christian Temperance Union. But here in Texas, there was another group known as the United Friends of Temperance, and other fundamental Protestants that supported this. Who didn't support this? Well, Catholics didn't, because that was part of their ceremony in their religious ceremonies, but the temperance movement does gain some traction, and you can see that there actually was legislation put forth that stopped, but there was legislation put forth to try to make Texas dry, and that fails in a larger vote, however. We start to see Republicans themselves become marginalized because this is a group mainly made up of African Americans in Texas at this time. The leader of the Republican Party in Texas at this time was a light-skinned African American man named Norris Wright Cooney. He was a black politician from Galveston. So they will put forth candidates frequently, and he'll be leading this and helping put forth candidates at this time. But one of the problems was the decrease in number of African Americans as opposed to the rest of the population. And you can see that number, 31% of the population in 1870. By 1900, it reduced to 20%. Some of them moved to other areas, and it's just a sheer number of people that moved to Texas. The number of African Americans decreased. We also see some what's called lily white Republicans, that were white Republicans that leave the Republican Party and join the Democratic Party during this time period. We also know that lynchings did occur, and just to define what a lynching was, essentially this was a vigilante act in which African American males, normally, and the most common cause of lynching was a false accusation of rape. And the reason I say false accusation of rape of a black male onto a white female is because I've seen no evidence in this time period from a lynching in which this actually occurred. These were false things that were caused. Sometimes it was because of a relationship that a black man and a white woman had. Most of the time it was a made-up story. Okay, and so basically a vigilante group would go into the prison or wherever the African American was, if they weren't arrested yet, literally rip them from their home and kill them. It didn't have to be a hanging, although that was the most common method, and this was used to kind of terrorize African Americans. And in addition to at voting booths, when African Americans tried to vote, there would be a definite effort to try to get them to stop through intimidation, which we'll talk about more here in just a minute. But one of the biggest movements that happens during this time period was a political party that was made up of farmers, known as the Populists. Now, this stems from the Grange movement, Texas Farmers Alliance, and here's some of their platforms that they were concerned in. The free coinage of silver, so to use the silver standard rather than the gold, and that was just goes back to what the Greenback Party wanted, which was more money in circulation in order to allow them to pay back their debts. They wanted subsidies to farmers to help them because the railroad rates were so high. They wanted an income tax. Now, this eventually does become a constitutional amendment. Yes, we did not have income taxes until then, because they were paying taxes the same as like a Jay Gould or a big businessman. They wanted a tax based on how much you made. And eventually this does become something. This Australian secret ballot, like you saw before when I showed you that clip, from the Free State of Jones, it used to be that you were kind of intimidated because everybody knew who you voted for. And the idea of that came from Australia of voting in secret, which we have today, they wanted as well. They also wanted the government to own the railroads. And the government is not going to own the railroads down the road, but they will regulate them. Here's an image, very famous image, and it would take, this was from the Grange movement, which was an early movement to try to promote farmers' rights and how important farmers are to America. And this was a very famous lithograph that was sent around talking about how important the farmer is to the rest of the United States. One of the most influential politicians of this time period was a governor by the name of James Stephen Hogg. He was actually the first Texas-born governor to serve. He was a very large man. I think he was around 250 pounds, but extremely tall. I'm not sure how tall he was, but he had a large presence to him. Everybody would he had a loud, booming voice, and this is before microphones and stuff like that. And so people would gather to hear him, right? And he does make a lot of positive reforms in Texas. He's generally seen by historians as relatively progressive, although I will say that he did not want complete African American suffrage, and he did support segregation. Okay, segregation will become legalized throughout the United States in 1896 with a Supreme Court case known as Plessy versus Ferguson. But he does allot money to UT Austin, Texas A&M to grow. He does create a home for disabled Confederate veterans. And he does campaign regarding African American rights against lynching. And probably one of the most famous lynching people was a black woman by the name of Ida B. Wells. And she launches her famous anti-lynching campaign at this time too. He was a very popular governor, and he is reelected in 1892. So the populist movement, even though Governor Hogg is on the Democratic ticket and he wins another election, all throughout the United States, the populist movement really gains quite a bit of momentum. This tells people, hey, we need to be paying attention to the concerns of the populist movement because they're gaining a lot of votes, okay? A lot of African Americans, especially those engaged in farming activities, begin to join the populist movement, and if they don't join, they vote for a lot of populist candidates. And in Hogg's second term, he hears this, right, concern, and he makes the Texas Railroad Commission. And initially, he makes it an appointed position, which upsets the populists. Later on, he'll actually make it an elected position. And he really does try to bring in a lot of populist votes and garner quite a bit of attention. Regarding women and minority rights at this time, as I mentioned before, Hogg does try to bring forth an anti-lynching bill, which fails in Texas, but he does try to bring an anti-lynching reform. There was no action, although there were many women in Texas that were trying to get their voices heard and trying to get suffrage. Suffrage means voting rights. Most famously, Rebecca Henry Haynes. She founds the Texas ERA in 1893. It was somewhat disorganized. It splits in 1895, and women will have a little more of a struggle to gain the right to vote. Mexican immigrants does continue to grow after the Civil War, mainly coming from Mexico, but not because there were a lot of opportunities in Texas. It was more because of the problems that were happening in South Texas at that time. And so they mainly were in the southern part of Mexico or Texas at this time. We also see a lot of rise of big business oriented Democrats at this time. So a lot of Democrats are going to turn their focus on helping big businessmen. A hog reformer wins the next election. Hogg decided not to run again, and so a man named Charles Cumberson wins the governorship at this time. Now, again, the populist candidate didn't win, but they took a lot of state and local offices. There were 24 in the state legislature. But this election itself was kind of questioned on whether or not a populist candidate should have won, because there were definite incidents of African American intimidation when African Americans tried to vote for populist candidates. There were armed men who literally escorted African Americans to the voting booths and told them who to vote for. There were some instances when they just simply got paid for it. Either way, there's definite evidence that this was a rigged election, right? The populist coalition actually breaks up in 1896 in the United States, and that's because there was a national candidate by the name of William Jennings Bryan who runs for the presidency, and he loses. But the populists become part of the Democrat, and their issues become a lot of the Democratic platform. And some people say that, that this was a disservice to the farmers because they were essentially just swallowed up by the Democrats. Some people saw it as positive. Either way, here's an interesting image to leave you with. And this is William Jennings Bryan. This is a political cartoon, and the Democratic Party kind of they said this image obviously saying that the Democrats gave up a lot of things that they shouldn't have stood for. Obviously, an anti-populist platform. But a lot of people saw this as the Democrats really absorbed the populist party. So that's really what happened regarding Texas, and nationally regarding some politics that were involved during the Gilded Age, and what happened to Texas really during the Gilded Age. In the next lecture, I'll talk specifically about something known as the progressive movement in Texas and Texas's involvement in World War I in the next lecture.